Okay, so let's go. We're on DAF Kuf Mem Beis Amud Aleph, and we were learning about the Shita of Rava. Rava is of the opinion that even though Chai Nosei Asatzmo, that a living creature is self-carrying, so if I carry a living creature, I'm not violating the Malacha of Hotza'ah on Shabbos. Nevertheless, if the living creature that I'm carrying is also carrying something or holding something that's inanimate, so then I'm in violation of Hotza'ah by virtue of the fact that I'm carrying it via the living being. So this is a chiddush, and the Gemara says that Rava's halacha is supported. So the Gemara now says, Tanya Kavase de Rava, it's the fourth line of the Gemara, Tanya Kavase de Rava. Hamotzi kelav mekupalim umunachim al kseifo v'sandalav v'taba osav biyado chayav. That first the Brisa tells me that if a person carries his clothing by slinging it over his shoulder or holding his ring and his sandals in his hands, since he's not wearing the clothing but rather carrying it, he's done the malacha. However, but when you're wearing your clothing, obviously you're not in violation. Hamotzi, excuse me. Hamotzi adam v'kelav olav v'sandalav v'raglav v'tabaosav biyadav patur. And then, but the last part of the Brisa is the telling part, that if a person were to carry a human being, and the human being that he's carrying is wearing clothing, so since that clothing is part of the human being, it's considered to be part of his person, so then I'm also patur for carrying the clothing. But v'ilu hosian kemo shehein chayav. But if you were the person that you're carrying is holding on to the clothing and not wearing them, so then you're going to be chayiv. So this proves the point that Rabbi was trying to make, that by carrying a creature, carrying an animated being who himself is holding on to inanimate objects, that makes me liable. Okay, let us go on. The Mishnah had also talked about not only carrying or holding on to a child that's holding a muktzah rock in his hand, but it also talked about the permissibility of picking up a basket that has a rock in it. And it said that even though the rock is muktzah, you're still allowed to pick up the basket. So the Gemara says, "V'amai tihavi kalkala basis l'davar ha'aser." Well, why should that be permitted? Why isn't the basket considered to be a base for a muktzah object, which itself makes the whole basket muktzah? Amar Rabba bar Barchana, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Hacha bekalkala malaya peros askinan. The reason is because we're talking about a basket that's filled with fruit. So the main function of the basket is to service the fruit, and the rock is considered to be only of lesser importance, and therefore the basket is no longer a basis l'davar ha'aser, it's primarily a basis l'davar ha'muter, and it has a davar ha'aser in it also. So I'm allowed to pick up the whole basket, even with the muktzah rock in it, because I need the fruit. So the Gemara's question is, v'lishdinu l'peri v'nishti le'evin v'niktinu biyadayim. So the Gemara's question is now, why don't you spill out, what right do you have to continue walking around with this basket with muktzah around the house? We should require you to spill out the fruit and spill out the rock out of the basket and pick up the fruit directly and bring it to wherever you need to bring it. So that will minimize your handling of muktzah. The Gemara answers, Rabbi Eloi Amar Rav, beperos hamitanfin, hachanami beperos hamitanfin. As we'll see momentarily, we're going to establish that in a certain situation we're talking about fruit that is very vulnerable, and if it falls on the ground, it could be easily damaged and dirtied and sullied, and therefore you don't want to spill it out. Like we're talking about strawberries, for example, soft, very fresh and ripe strawberries. If you spill them out of the basket, they're going to get spoiled and squashed and mushed up and dirty, because they'll hit the ground. So therefore, that's not a practical solution. So now the Gemara says, "V'lin arinhu ni'urei," but here's another eitzah, says the Gemara. Instead of walking around with the basket with the rock in it, why don't you just shake the basket lightly until the fruit moves to one side and the rock to the other side, and then spill out the rock that way, without spilling out the fruit. So Amar Rav Chia bar Ashi, Amar Rava, Hacha bekalkala pichusa askinan de even gufa nasis dofen lekalkala. Answers the Gemara, no, you want the rock to stay there because we're talking about a basket that is damaged. And the damage of the basket is such that there's a big hole in the side of the basket, and the rock actually acts as a cover. And if you were to dislodge the rock, all the berries would fall out of the hole. It's a stopper, effectively. And so that's why you don't want the rock out. You want the rock is actually serving a functional purpose, even though it may be muksa, because you may not have prepared it from before Shabbos and you got there however it got there. But the point is that you don't want to remove it, because otherwise your basket won't be able to carry the fruit. The fruit will spoil.
Is that borer, though?
It wouldn't be muksa.
Isn't it borer?
Taking the stone out of the...
So I originally thought when I looked at this that you're actually picking up the stone, but it's really not, because the stone is muksa. So a careful reading of Rashi sort of tells you that Rashi's not advocating that you actually pick out the rock.
If you shook it out, wouldn't it still be borer?
No, it's not. It's not borer. You're not doing it biyadayim.
But then isn't the stone not muksa? It's part of the basket?
Well, that's the point. That's what I just farvorned, right? I just said that the issue that we're dealing with here is that you didn't prepare the stone from before Shabbos. It wasn't prepared from before. If it was prepared from before as part of the basket, then it wouldn't be muksa bichlal. You have to say that you discovered that it was there, but it was unanticipated. It's not really part of the kliyah. It's fortuitous that it happens to be there. Exactly. Okay, so next. Metaltal and truma v'chulei. The next thing that we saw is that you're allowed to carry around the basket or a container or some trough that has both tamei truma and tahor truma. Now the tamei truma is problematic because it's muktzah. It has no function other than being used as fuel by a kohen for his fire, which you can't do on Shabbos. So the point of this is that even though some of the items in this container are muktzah and some are not, you're allowed to carry the whole container. Some are Rav Chisda lo shanu ela shetahora lamato tmei lamala. The only time that you're allowed to carry the whole container is when the tohor non-muktzah stuff is on the bottom and the tamei muktzah stuff is on top. Aval tahora lamalo tmei lamata shakule letahora v'shavak le'latameya. But if the tohor stuff would be on top, you would have a much more simple solution. Just remove the tohor stuff out of the basket and take it wherever you need it to go, and then you leave the basket where it is. You don't have a heter to go ahead and move the basket. So the Gemara says, "V'chi tahor lamata nami l'shtinhu v'lin katinhu." But the Gemara says, but I don't understand. According to that argument, then even if the tohor stuff is beneath the tamei stuff, the muktzah stuff is on top, you should be obligated to spill it out onto the ground, spill out all of the fruit, and then just pick up the non-muktzah stuff and bring it over to the table. So Amar Rabbi Eloi, Amar Rav, B'peros hamitan fin askinon, and that's the answer that we saw before, is that we're dealing with like very ripe strawberries, that if you were to spill them out, you would spoil them, and that's why this is not a practical solution. So Meisvei, now we're going to challenge Rav Chisda's premise. Remember, what did Rav Chisda say? He said that you only have a right to carry the basket if the muktzah stuff is on top, in which case you can't access the non-muktzah stuff directly, so you have to carry the whole basket until you get to the table, and then you can spill it out on the table. So the question is, metaltal and truma tameim at tahora v'machulin bein shetahora l'maylo tamei lamata bein shetamei lamalo tahora lamata. To you, the Rav Chisda, the Brisa says that you're allowed to handle a container that contains both tamei truma and tahor truma, or truma and chulin, where you're not a kohen, and therefore the truma is also muktzah for you. And it makes no difference whether the muktzah food is on top or on bottom. You're always allowed to carry the entire container. So this is a challenge to Rav Chisda, because Rav Chisda says that we only let you carry the entire container as if the muktzah item is on top. So the Gemara says, Armalacha Rav Chisda masnisin l'tzarach gufo braysa l'tzarach mekomo. So Rav Chisda says you have to explain that the difference between our Mishnah and that braysa is that our Mishnah is talking about where you need the item itself. you need the muktzah item. In other words, the reason why you want to access the basket is because you want the muktzah, the non-muktzah berries, you want to eat those now. And so that's why I say that if you can access those non-muktzah berries without having to move the entire basket, then you're obligated to remove just the top berries that are non-muktzah and leave the basket where it is, so you don't have to end up carrying the basket. But the Brisa is talking about where your objective in moving the basket is not to access the non-muktzah berries. Your objective is because the basket in its entirety is resting on something that you need. Let's say it's on your bed and you want to take a nap. So then you're justified in moving the entire basket, and you can't give me the solution of just pulling out the non-muktzah berries because the basket's still going to be on your bed and you won't be able to sleep. So that's why the Brisa says that it makes no difference whether the muktzah is on top or the muktzah is on bottom. You have a justification to move the basket because you need the place where the basket is resting. So the Gemara's question is, "My duchke de Rav Chisda leukmi masnisin letzarech gufa." So the question is, well, Rav Chisda, why did you start off on this path to begin with? What did you see in our Mishnah to force you to say that our Mishnah is talking about a different case from the Brisa, whereas the Brisa is talking about Tzorech Mekomo, and you're saying the Mishnah is talking about Tzorech Gufo, and therefore you make an ukimta, you qualify it and say that it's only permitted to move the whole basket if the muktzah item is on top. Where do you see that in our Mishnah? So the Gemara says, Amar Rava masnisin kavose daika, deketani seifa mo she'al hakar min ha'eres hakar ve'hei noflos. That is, we'll see the next part of the Mishnah, which was, when we turn the page, we'll see the next part of the Mishnah, is talking about a pillow or a cushion that's on your bed. And the Mishnah over there says that if you want to sleep on the cushion, then you're allowed to shake off the coin that's resting on the cushion or the pillow. And that way the coin will fall off so that you can use the pillow. It's clearly indicated in that case that your objective is to use the pillow, because if your objective was to get to the place where the pillow was resting, then you could pick up the whole pillow together with the coin and not just tilt the pillow until the coin falls off. So by virtue of the fact, V'amar Rabba bar Chanam Rabbi Yochanan lo shanu ela l'tzarech gufa l'tzarech mekoma metaltlo va'oden olav. And Rabba bar Chanam explained in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that the only time that you're restricted to only tilting the cushion so that the coin falls off is because you want the cushion, you want to sleep on it. But if you actually needed the place where the cushion was resting, then you'd be justified in doing even more. You could pick up the entire pillow with the coin on it and move it. So you see, the very fact that the next Mishnah, which is the second part of this Mishnah, is talking about a case of Tzarech Gufo, so Rav Chisda deduces that our Mishnah is also L'Tzarech Gufo, where you need the fruit that's inside the basket and not just need the place where the basket is resting. And that's what forced Rav Chisda to make this qualification, that it depends if the muktzah item is on top or the non-muktzah item is on top. Let's go weiter. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Af Ma'alin V'chulei. Rabbi Yehuda says that not only are you permitted to handle muktzah under certain conditions, but even if you have a case of meduma. Now let's refresh our memories. What is the case of meduma? If a person has one measure of truma that falls into 100 measures of chulin, then you have what's called bittul. You've nullified the presence of truma. But the chachamim that require you, in order for you to treat this like chulin, the chachamim require one more step. And that is, now that you have 101 parts in front of you, take out one of, and it's all mixed in together. You don't see where the truma is. You don't see, because it's all like, say, grain, right? So you don't know what's what. Take out one measure out of the 101 and discard it. And the remaining 100 is considered to be totally chulin. So it's a chumrah of the chachamim, even though you're not really removing the original truma, because the original truma is batel, but we view it almost as if you've removed something.
You don't benefit then.
You're not benefiting from it. Whatever the motivation is, this is a requirement the Chachamim placed in order for you to accomplish bittul. So Rabbi Yehuda says that you're allowed to do this even on Shabbos, which is surprising, because normally you're not allowed to tithe to rectify something to make it edible on Shabbos. So that's the Gemara's question. V'amai hakom esakein. Aren't you doing tikkun? Aren't you rectifying the grain to make it now edible, whereas previously it was not, and that's not permitted on Shabbos? So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eliezer Sfirale, the Amar Truma Be'ena Machata. Answers the Gemara that Rabbi Yehuda holds like Rabbi Eliezer, who says that we use our imagination, really is what we're going to have to say, and we view it as if that one scoop or one measure of grain that I'm removing from the 101 parts is actually all truma. We view it as if it's all truma. And as such, it is considered to be discrete and distinct from the rest. It's already considered to be separated, and therefore I'm not really rectifying it or tithing it by removing it, because it's already considered halachically to be distinct. So I'm not doing the same kind of tikkun that I'm doing when I'm actually tithing, because tithing transforms the entire mixture. Here, it's already, you view it as if the portion that I'm taking off is 100% truma, and the rest is now chulin.
Isn't it still borer?
No, it's not borer because it's all the same. It's all the same grain. Yes.
Just back up and say this idea of making something, doing the chumrah of taking something out so that you can then eat it. When something's bittul, we never do that.
We never do that. This is an exceptional case. This is a case by truma because of its special kedusha, that the Chachamim required you this. Right. If a little piece of pig juice falls into my cholent, and I have 60 times the cholent to nullify the pig juice, so it's bottle. You don't have to take out anything afterwards. You're absolutely right. This is an exception.
But here, if he eats the whole thing, he's eating truma. But we don't know which part.
It's bottle. There's a principle of bittul. Bittul is a principle that works midioraisa. So this is only a rabbinical requirement to take out a measure. But so goes Rabbi Yehuda so far as to say that it's considered to be discrete and distinct already even before I take it out. So that you imagine it as if it's a piece of truma that's already there in the corner that I just have to take away, but it's already considered to be distinct and discrete. So now the Gemara says Ditnan. Now where do you see that Rabbi Eliezer holds this way? Because we have the following Mishnah: Sa'a truma shenaflu lepachos mimeya v'nidma'u v'naflu min hameduma l'makom acher. So the case is as follows: I have a scoop of truma that falls into a bunch of chulin. The only problem is that this chulin does not have 100 times the amount of truma. In which case, the entire mixture is called meduma, and it all has to be treated as truma. It can only be eaten by a kohen. Now, let's say some of this meduma mixture, one scoop of this mixture, then falls into other chulin. Okay, so it fell into chulin A, and now a scoop of that new mixture falls into chulin B. Now, the question is like this. I know that from the original truma, there's a minuscule amount. When I look at the amount of chulin in chulin B, do I need 100 times the scoop that went in, or just 100 times the minuscule amount of truma that is contained within it, even though I call it truma now? So that's the issue, is that Rabbi Eliezer Omer medamaas ketrumas vadai v'chachamim omrim ein hameduma medameya elo lefi cheshbon. So this is the machlokas. Rabbi Eliezer says you use your imagination. And since halachically this has the status of truma, then you need 100 times that scoop of mixture of meduma in order to consider it to be batel in chulin B. But the chachamim say no. You just need to look at the ratio of how much original truma was in there, and you only need 100 times that amount in chulin B in order to consider it to be null and void. But what we see from Rabbi Eliezer is that we can look at the truma as it's distinct and discrete, we use our imagination, and we look at it as if it's now all truma. So the same thing, says the Gemara, we want to make the analogy here too, is that since the Chachamim require me to take off a piece, then we look at that piece that I have to take off as if it's all truma, just like Rabbi Eliezer looks at the meduma as all truma. So the Gemara says that's not a good analogy, because the Gemara says, Emer d'shamaslei l'chumra l'kula mishamaslei. Because maybe Rabbi Eliezer only holds l'chumra, that you look at a mixture of chulin and truma as being all truma. But to say l'kula, that will allow you to separate something or tithe it on Shabbos l'kula, because we look at it as all truma, where do you see that Rabbi Eliezer would ever say that? So Elahu da'amar karib Shimon. So you're right, says the Gemara. It's not, Rabbi Yehuda's not going like Rabbi Eliezer. He's going like Rabbi Shimon. Kidetnan sa'a truma shenaflu lameya v'lo hispik lahagbiya at shenafla acheres harezu asura v'Rabbi Shimon matir. The machlokus in this case is as follows. I have a scoop of truma that falls into 100 parts of chulin. Now, 5 minutes later, another scoop of truma falls into that mixture. So the question is, how do I view this? The Chachamim say that you view it as follows. You look at it as if two scoops each one fell into, there's only 50 parts to nullify each one of these scoops. You don't have 100 parts because you have to have 50 parts for each scoop now, so you don't have enough to make it bottle. But Rabbi Eliezer views it differently. Rabbi Eliezer says no. You look at the first scoop of truma that fell in, that's now totally mixed, as being discrete and distinct from the rest of the chulin for the purposes of the second scoop. So when the second scoop falls in, you still have 100 parts chulin to nullify it. Okay? You got it?
Yeah. How far can you go with
Yeah.
How much dilution
what
can
point
you go
you forever,
with?
like-
How far can you go?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't know.
Because wouldn't be like the first one falls in and gets bottled, and then the second.
No,
Doesn't get bottled.
that's not what the Gemara is suggesting here at this point. One second. That's an excellent point, but we're not there yet. The Gemara's thinking is like this: the fact that, according to Reb Shimon, you can view the first scoop of truma that fell in as distinct from the rest of the chulin, even though it's completely mixed in, is a sign that Rabbi Yehuda subscribes to that. You look at that scoop that you're removing on Shabbos as all truma, as distinct and removed, and therefore you're not doing an act of tikkun. That's the analogy to Reb Shimon. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute. Umimai dilma hasam b'hakam iflagi. The Tanakama Savar Aflagab the Naflu Bazeh Achar command the Naflu Bevas Achas Dami V'halacham Shenafla V'halacham Shenafla. Reb Shimon Savar Kamaisa Bottle B'meya V'hati Bottle B'meya V'chad. Maybe not that way, says the Gemara. Maybe the way that the machlokas between the Chachamim and Reb Shimon is as follows. The Chachamim view it as when one scoop falls in 5 minutes after the first scoop, it's as if they fall in at the same time, and if you have two measures, then you need 200 times the two measures, and if you only have 100 versus 2, you only have a 50-to-1 ratio, and therefore it's not bottle. But Reb Shimon says no. Reb Shimon says the first scoop fell in, it became bottle, and it becomes now like you have 101 components of chulin to the new scoop of truma that falls in now, which will now be bottle on 101 parts of chulin. Maybe that's the way Reb Shimon looks at it, and not because he views the truma to be distinct and discrete. So the Gemara therefore says you're right? You can't look at it. We can't find support for Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Shimon, because maybe that's the way that you're supposed to view the machlokes. And therefore comes along the Gemara and says, so Ella Huda Amar Ka Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. So the Gemara says the Rabbi Yehuda shita of looking at it as discrete and distinct is like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. The Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer no sein einav b'tzad zeh v'ochel mitzad acher. That according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, if you have meduma on Shabbos, then you don't even have to remove it. You can just say, I am going to eyeball that corner of that container over there. That'll be the truma that I have to remove, and the rest of it I'm allowed to eat. So you see that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar looks at using your imagination and saying that this corner, which contains a discrete amount of truma, and the truma is all extracted to that corner, and everything else now is mutter, is now chulin. That's what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says. You can imagine it, and that's what Rabbi Yehuda is saying. Rabbi Yehuda is saying is that it's not an act of tikkun because it's already separated. So the Gemara says, so you're telling me that Rabbi Yehuda subscribes to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar? One second. Umi savrlo kilei kavase. Since when can Rabbi Yehuda hold like that? V'hamiflik poligiluya. But the Brisa says explicitly that there's a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. What's the machlokas? The Tanya. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Malinis Hamaduma Be'echad Umeya, and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer Nosen Einav Bitzad Zev Ochel Mitzad Acher. The Gemara says, the Brisa says that they argue. Whereas according to Rabbi Yehuda, you actually have to remove that 101, that one portion out of 101 of meduma. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says you don't even have to do that because you can just eyeball it and just eat everything else and just leave that portion without having to remove it. So you see that they argue. So how can you tell me that they hold like each other? So the Gemara answers the Rabbi Yehuda Adifa mit Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Rabbi Yehuda has an even better imagination than Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Meaning what? He views that one portion of that you have to remove as being even more distinct and discrete from Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Because Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, you know why the Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar doesn't permit you to remove it? Because he says it's like an act of tikkun. But Rabbi Yehuda says, I view this as being so distinct and being so completely truma and being so distinct from the rest that you can even take it out because you're not doing tikkun anymore because it's already separated. And so but basically they're holding the same way. It's that both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon hold that one out of 101 that you need to set aside as truma is already considered to be set aside. Just to what degree can you imagine it as being set aside? Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, enough such that you can eat everything else without removing it. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you can even remove it because there's no tikkun bichlal.
But according to that viewpoint then, going back to the case where a portion fell into less than 100, you could add chulin to that to make it up to 100, and then it's no longer meduma.
It's a good argument, but ein mevatel isser lechatchila. We don't allow you to be mevatel isser. The Chachamim don't permit you to deliberately go ahead and nullify that which is
But if it fell by accident, the chulin?
by accident. That's something else.
And
If the
he's
chulin falls by
rectifying
accident.
the accident. That's what he's
So the question is, would you be able to? Do you say chaticha naases nevela? This is a whole discussion in Yoredeya, which we're not going to get into now. There may be an opinion that says that once the mixture chaps a din of being usher, then if more chulin is added to it, you don't have enough. That's really what we saw before. We saw, do you need enough chulin to be added to it? That's the chulin A and chulin B case. How much, if this falls into additional chulin, how much do you need in order to call it to be batel? Do we say chaticha nases nevela, that the original mixture is now viewed as completely truma, like Rabbi Eliezer had said, or do we view it now, still no, as being just a mixture of truma and chulin? We got to go weiter.
But also could it be that...
You sure this is important enough for us to go late today?
Up to you.
No, it's up to you.
I think it's important, but it's up to
Okay.
you. Because what I think is like, it could be that the reason why it's okay to separate it in Shabbos is because when the portion fell in, according to the Raisa, we can't mevatel. The extra portion they take out is really... It's only a chumrah.
It's only a derabbanan. Correct.
So it could be that you're really not separating anything. You can, according to the Raisa, you could just eat it.
No, enochinami, exactly. First of all, the bittul could even be a bittul midiraisa, like Rabbi Yehuda says, bittul barov, that the truma is batel. Okay, there's a lot more to discuss. Let's go weiter. This is Daf Yomi Rabbi Say. Mishnah. Ha'even sha'al pi ha'chaves amata al tzida v'hino felis. If you have we've seen this Mishnah before, if you have a stone that's muktzah, that's resting on top of a barrel, and you want to access the contents of the barrel, so you have a problem because you can't remove the stone directly, so what you are allowed to do is tilt the barrel, the rock will fall off, and then you can access the contents. Haisa ben hachavuyos, if however, the barrel is in a storehouse where it's adjacent to other barrels, and by tilting the barrel, the rock may fall off and damage or affect other barrels, so then magbiha umata al tzida, then you can actually lift up the barrel, move it to a place where by tilting it you won't damage other barrels, and then you can tilt the barrel and the rock will fall off. V'hino felis. Mo shal akar minaheres akar v'hinoflos. Now, if you have money that's resting on a pillow, you're allowed to shake the pillow until the money falls off, and vehinoflos will fall off. Haisalav lashleshes. If, however, the pillow has some kind of yucky stuff on it, which the Rashi just says anything yucky like mucus or saliva or excrement, the Aruch says
translate it as a bird dung.
I was about to say the Aruch translates it as bird excrement. That's okay. So mekancha bismartut, then you can wipe it off with a rag. However, you're not allowed to apply water because that would be a form of laundering, which is not permitted on Shabbos. If, however, the pillow's surface is leather and not fabric, then you can even pour water on it until the stain is removed. Now, you're not allowed to actually do a more vigorous laundering process even on leather, because there is a type of laundering that is subject even to leather, but this kind of just surface rinsing off is okay for leather.
That would work on a leather jacket as well.
It will work presumably on a leather jacket, certainly on shoes. We talked about this before. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, Lo Shanu Ela B'Shoicheach Aval B'Miniach Nasa Basis L'Davar Ha'asur. As we've said before, that this is only, halacha will only hold true that you can tilt the barrel, and the barrel is non-muksa, just the rock on top of it, as if you had forgotten accidentally and left the rock there. But if you had intentionally put the rock there from before Shabbos, so then the entire barrel is muksa, because it's a basis, it's a base for a muksa object, and you're not allowed to tilt the barrel. Okay, haisa ben achavuyos chule, if the barrel was between other barrels, you can lift it up. Mantana decholhecha deika isura vehetera tarchinun beisura lo tarchinun. It seems from our Mishnah, that you always have to handle the non-muksa item over the muksa item, even when there's more exertion and inertia involved by handling the non-muksa item. And that's the point of this discussion. Who is the author of that position who says that even when there's more tircha, even when there's more exertion involved, you always your fallback position is always to deal with the non-muksa item versus the muksa item. So Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. It's Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Ditnan haborer kitnis b'yom tov. You know that you're allowed to separate good from bad on Yantif. The laws of Borer are much more liberal on Yantif. So therefore, if you're separating pebbles from beans on Yantif so that you can cook the beans, so Beishamai Omrim Borer Ochel V'Oichel. Beishamai limits you on how you're supposed to do Borer even on Yantif. And he says, even though normally you pull out the pebbles from the beans, on Yantif you have to pull out the beans and then you can eat the beans that way. And Beis Hillel are more liberal, and they say borer kedarko b'cheiku v'tamchoy. And Beis Hillel says no. If you normally pull out the pebbles, and use whatever instruments you normally use in order to do the act of separation. V'tanya Amar Rav Shimon ben Gamliel bamed dvar mamurim sha'ochel merubal apsolos. When is it that Beis Hillel tells you to do it in this fashion, where he says you can actually pull out the pebbles from the food? He says that's only when there's more food than pebbles. In which case, you're going to be doing more tircha if we were to force you to pull out the food. Right. Aval psolas merubal ha'ochel divrei hakol borer va'ochel. But if there's more psolas, if there's more waste product than food, then everyone holds that you should pull out the food, because that's more efficient, as you said. So the question that the Gemara is going to ask is, V'hahacha dechi oichel meruba al hapsoilas dami, but our case, it seems to be not like that, because our case is where you're exerting yourself more by lifting up the barrel, schlepping it over there in order to get the rock off of it. It would be so much easier to push off the rock or lift off the rock directly. But by doing this, because we want you to avoid handling the muksa, that's like a case of where you have to use more inertia in order to handle in a permissible fashion. So that's like a case where there's more permissible food, and yet still, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says when there's more inertia involved, you have to use the more efficient fashion. So why don't we say the same thing over here? Work more efficiently, even if it means handling the muktzah directly. So the Gemara's answer is as follows: Hachanami keben di boy lo mishka lo mishtaka le yain adeshaka le laevin kipsolos meruba lo oichel dami. So adeshaka la rather kipsolos meruba lo oichel dami. The Gemara answers is that, look, at the end of the day, you're going to need to access this barrel and tip it over anyway, because when you want to get the wine out of the barrel, let's say, you're going to have to spill it over in order to get the wine out, to get the last drop out. You have to turn it all the way upside down. So if we know that eventually you're going to have to spill this barrel anyway, so we're not actually telling you to do any additional exertion. It's just telling you to do it now instead of waiting until later to do it. So pick up the barrel now, move it over to the side. You'd have to do that anyway to access all of its contents. And it's not additional exertion because Lamaisa you'd have to use that same exertion anyway to empty the barrel at some point in the future as well. Okay, let's go weiter. Haisa bein hachavuyos magbia, the same Gemara, that if it's between the barrels you can lift up the barrel and move it over and then tilt it over to get the rock off. Tanya Rabbi Yossi Omer Haisa hachavis munachas ba'otzar. The Brisa just elaborates this point. It says if the barrel was in a warehouse with other barrels, or if there are glass utensils that are just adjacent to or underneath the barrel, so that if you were to tilt it over and let the rock fall, it would crash on those glass utensils and break them. So then magbiya lamakom acher umata al tzida v'hinofeles v'notel hemena mashitzarach lo machzir lemakoma. So then you're allowed to pick up the barrel, move it over to a place where the spilling of the rock will not cause damage, and then you can and take out whatever you need from the barrel, and then you can even put the barrel back in its original place. So the Brisa just adds a little bit of additional information. Next, Mo Shal Hakar, if you have money that's resting on a pillow, Amar Rav Chia bar Ashi, Amar Rav Lo Shanu Ela B'Sheicheach, Avon B'Meniach Nasa Basis L'Davar HaAsr, like we said before, by the barrel, that it's only permitted to shake the pillow if the pillow is not a basis, which means that you did not intentionally put the money down knowing that it was there when Shabbos came in. It's if you forgot it, you weren't aware of it. That's when we say that the pillow is not a basis, and therefore you can shake the pillow to get the money off. Amar Rabba bar Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Lo Shanu Ela Litzarach Guf, Lo Tzarach Makoma, V'taltalo Va'odan Olav. That we just saw this Gemara a moment ago on Amid Aleph. It said that this halacha that you're obligated to shake the pillow to get the money off is only true when you want the pillow to remain on the bed so that you can sleep on it. That's when you're restricted, that you can only shake the pillow to get the money off. But if you need the place where the pillow is resting for some other utility, then you can even pick up the pillow with the money on it and move it to wherever you need to move it. And the Brisa says that as well. Let us go on. Again, we're talking about shaking the pillow and getting the money off. Amar Raboshi, Ashachach Arnaki B'Chatzer, Miniach Aleha Kikar Otina Kumetaltla, a huge heter, which I don't think is la halacha, but I'm not sure. Raboshi says that if you forget a money bag, a big bag of money, you leave it out in your courtyard, and you're worried that someone's going to steal it on Shabbos, so what's the solution? You know that famous joke where the Rebbe says, Shabbos here, Shabbos there, right? Okay, now that's not the solution over here. The solution is, if you never heard the joke, you can ask me later. But that's an old one, right? The solution over here is take a loaf of bread or a child and place it on top of the money bag. So now you're sort of making it less muktzah, because you're making it now something that's going to help you carry the loaf of bread. And then the bag is now a support not just for the money, but it's also a support for a loaf of bread or a baby, and then you can pick up the whole geschäft and carry it into the house.
So, doesn't the Davar Choshev have to be there from Erev Shabbos?
Yeah.
You would think so, which is why I'm not sure if this is la halacha, so that's a good point. Amar Rav Yitzchak, Shachach Levena B'Chatzer, similarly, if you leave out an expensive construction brick that you need for construction and you leave it out in your chatzir, or maybe you're scared it's going to get damaged if you leave it out there, you can again place a child or a loaf of bread on top of it and then bring it inside.
Isn't that what they did for the Melech?
What?
Isn't that what they did for the Melech?
Oh, so that's something different. You're going to see, we'll talk about the case of the mace. Amar Rabbi Yehuda bar Shila, Amar Rabbi Asi, Pamecha shachachu diskaya malaya mos b'sartaya. There was once a case that not only did they do this in a chatzir, which is a reshus hayachid, they once forgot a sack of money and they left it out and was left out in a reshus harabim. So this was now not only an issue of muktzah, it's also an issue of hotzah. So ubo v'shalus Rabbi Yochanan v'amar lahen hanicho le'al kikar otinot v'til telua. He said, go ahead, you can put a child or a loaf of bread on it, and you can actually pick it up and even transport it as long as you go less than Dalet Amos, as Rashi qualifies it, or you make a human wall. We're going to learn about making this human wall in Maseches Eruvin, where you actually construct two lines of people so that you're walking in between the people. It's a special heter dispensation when you really get stuck. So, and Omar Marzutra Hilchasa Kecholhani Shmaitza B'Shoicheach. And Marzutra says the halacha, you can be liberal over here as long as you had forgotten it. Not if but if you intentionally put it down there before Shabbos and then you change your mind, then it's not going to work. Rav Ashi Amar Afilo Shochach Nomi Lo. Rav Ashi says, I disagree. Even if you forgot it, accidentally you left it out there, we still are not going to let you rely on these heterim. V'lo Amru Kikar Otinok Ela L'meis Bilvad. And the only time that we allow you to place a child or a loaf of bread on something that's muktzah in order to carry it is only by a corpse. That was what they did with David HaMelech. It's only by a corpse. If you're just for kavod hameis, you don't want the corpse to decompose in the sun, then we allow you because of that Kavanah Mesa aspect, will allow you to put a child or a loaf of bread on the corpse in order to transport it inside. Abaya manach kipa akipi, Rava manach sakina abaryona umetaltala. So Abaya once placed a kippah. He took a little shovel and he placed it upon some sheaves of wheat, which presumably were muktzah, in order to give him the rationale to transport the sheaves of wheat inside the house. And Rava took a knife and put it on a raw, unsalted piece of poultry, like a dove that had been shechted, in order to be able to bring it into the house. Also presumably muktzah. So Amar of Yoseph, kama charifa shmaitza de dardiki. Amar da Amar Rabbanan b'shalcheach lechatchila mi Amor. So Rav Yosef says these young whippersnappers is literally what he's saying. He's that these kids, these young rabbis, these kids these days, they got no respect. In other words, what he's saying is that they're being too liberal. That normally the halacha is that only, like we had said before, only if you accidentally left it there before Shabbos. But if you left it there intentionally on Shabbos and you want to change your mind, you don't have a heter to handle muksa in this fashion by putting something non-muksa on top of it. So Amar Abaya ilav the adam chashuvana kipa lamali hachazul lemizgo alayu. So Abaya responds to Yosef, says, no, it's not because I'm a whippersnapper that I did this. I'm not being precocious. The reality is that these sheaves are not muksa at all, because I can use them to sit down on them on Shabbos, and I knew that all the time. But I wanted to show that I want to be machmir because I'm an adam chashuv. And therefore, I put something non-muksa on them just as an added chumrah. And Rava said the same thing. Amar Rava ana ilavda adam chashuv ana sakina abar yona lamali hachazi lilu umtsa. Rava says the things the same. This raw poultry can be used as there are people who eat chicken tartar, and so like chicken sushi. I don't know, whatever you're going to call it. So the point is that he said that this type it's not chicken. It's a more delicate type of meat, so therefore it can be eaten raw, so it's not muktzah, and therefore I'm only doing this as an added chumrah to put a knife on top of it, but really it's not muktzah to begin with. So the Gemara says, "Time the chazi umtza." You see, says the Gemara, that Rava was only permissive because this freshly shechted dove could be consumed by human beings as a piece of raw meat. Ha lo chazi umtza lo. But if it were not consumable for a human being, but rather was only consumable to a pet, then that would not be enough to be considered non-muktzah, because we know under normal conditions, if you have an expensive piece of meat that a human being would not eat raw, but your dog would eat it, it's still muktzah, because since it's set aside for human consumption because of its very expensive value, so then you can't say, well, it's non-muktzah because my dog can eat it. So you see, this is what Rav is holding. Remember, the Rava Rabbi Yehuda Sphirale. You mean to tell me that Rava holds like Rabbi Yehuda, who says that just because something is usable for your pet doesn't mean that it's non-muktzah, it's still muktzah. So v'ha'amar Rava l'shamei tevili bar avza v'shadi me'eha l'shunra. But don't we know that there was once a Maisa where Rava on Yantif told his attendant, he said, roast for me a goose, and when you shecht it and you pull out the kishkas and give it to the cat. So you see that even though these kishkas are considered to be muktzah because they're not set aside for the cat, Rava still gave a heter to go ahead and handle them directly. See, normally you would save those kishkas and save them for the next day. And they're considered to be muktzah for the cat. So by what right did Rava have to tell his shamas to handle them directly and give them to the cat? So the Gemara answers, Hasam kevin de misrach daiti iluye me esmol. The Gemara says, in that situation, you don't say that the goose intestines are set aside, are precluded for animal use, and they're set aside for human consumption. Since Rava knew that if I'm going to shech the goose today, I can't leave the intestines over for tomorrow, and I'm not going to eat the intestines today, he had in mind all along that a portion of this goose was going to be set aside for his cat, and therefore he prepared it accordingly from before Yantif. The only time we say that something which is consumable for humans is muktzah for animals is only when it was not anticipated to be able to use a portion of it for your pet from before Shabbos or Yantif. And that's why Rav had to say that this raw dove is consumable for me, and therefore it's not muktzah. We'll hold it here for today.